Thrown out at 14, she built a trash log cabin. Winter proved it was genius. Dag Kavernmo, who had survived 9 Wisconsin winters and buried a wife and infant son to the cold, told her plainly, "You cannot stay here. Then you will die." She had $9, no family, and needed shelter from timber no sawmill would touch. But the cabin she built from garbage would not only save her life, it would save 18 lives, including the daughter of the very man who tried to destroy her. And the letter hidden beneath the hearthstone had not been written by a stranger. It had been written by the father she thought had left her nothing. On January 12th, 1888, the temperature dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. But 5 months earlier, Solveig Asmundsen had never built anything larger than a chicken coop in her life. She walked into the slash field on the 23rd of August, 1887, carrying everything she owned: a change of clothes wrapped in burlap, her mother's Bible, her father's hand axe, and $9 in coins sewn into the hem of her dress. She was 14 years old. She had nowhere else to go. The Hendricksons had kept her for 13 months after her mother died. Mrs. Hendrickson needed help with the washing and the children and the garden, and Solveig worked from before dawn until after dark without complaint. She slept in a corner of the kitchen on a straw tick. She ate what the family left. She told herself it was temporary. Then Mrs. Hendrickson caught fever in August and died within a week. Mr. Hendrickson remarried before the month was out. A widow from Wausau with 3 children of her own. The new Mrs. Hendrickson looked at Solveig the way one looks at a stray dog that has wandered into the house. The Norwegian girl must go, she told her husband. Solveig heard it through the kitchen wall. "We have enough mouths." Mr. Hendrickson gave her the $9 her parents had left. Money he had held in trust for over a year. He did not meet her eyes. He told her the Lutheran church in Merrill might find her a placement. He told her she was a good worker and would land on her feet. He did not offer to drive her to town. Solveig walked 12 miles north instead of south. Her father had worked a logging claim near the Tomahawk River before he died. She remembered him describing the land: good timber, cold creek, a meadow where a cabin might sit. The loggers had come through since then and taken everything worth taking. But the land was still there, and no one else wanted it. What she found was devastation. The logging crews had stripped the forest like locusts. Stumps dotted the hillside, some taller than she was, their raw cuts already graying in the weather. Huge piles of branches and treetops lay tangled where they had fallen, brown needles carpeting the ground. The creek still ran clear, but its banks were gouged with drag marks where they had skidded logs to the water. And everywhere lay the wood they had not wanted. Crooked logs, knotty logs. Hollow logs split down the center, small diameter poles too thin to be worth the hauling, hardwood that would sink instead of float, pieces broken during felling, pieces rotted on one end. The ground was thick with them, a graveyard of timber that no sawmill would touch. Solveig stood in the middle of the slash field and turned in a slow circle. This was what remained. This was what she had. She made camp that night beside the creek under a lean-to of branches propped against a fallen pine. She built a small fire and ate the last of the bread Mrs. Hendrickson had grudgingly provided. The August night was warm, but she knew what was coming. She had lived in Wisconsin all her life. She knew what winter meant. 6 months. She had perhaps 6 months before the killing cold arrived, and she had nothing. No cabin, no tools beyond a hand axe, no food stores, no firewood. Just $9 and a field full of rubbish. She did not sleep well. Dag Kvernmo appeared on the third day. She heard him before she saw him. The heavy footsteps of a man who had spent decades walking through forest. He emerged from the tree line to the east, a weathered Norwegian with a gray beard and hands like oak roots. He stopped at the edge of her camp and studied her with eyes that had seen too much death. "You are the Asmundsen girl," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, your father worked this claim before the company bought the rights." "Yes." Dag looked at the slash field, then at her lean-to, then at the hand axe leaning against a stump. He shook his head slowly. "You cannot stay here." Solvi felt her jaw tighten. "I have nowhere else to go." "Then you will die." He said it simply, without cruelty, the way one might observe that winter follows autumn. "I have lived 9 winters in this country. I buried my first wife and my infant son in the winter of '81. The cold took them in the night while the fire burned. I have helped bury 4 neighbors since. I know what kills people out here." He stepped closer, and Solvi saw the scars on his hands, white lines where frostbite had taken the skin. "A proper cabin needs 60 logs minimum, straight timber, 8 inches across, 16 feet long. Do you see any such timber here?" She did not answer. "The loggers took it, all of it. What they left is garbage. Twisted, split, hollow garbage that a sawmill would not touch." He gestured at the slash field. "You cannot build with this. No one can. Then I will build something else." Dag's expression did not change. "You would need 6 cords of firewood to survive a winter in any structure you could build. 8 cords to be safe. Each cord weighs 3,000 pounds. To fell, buck, split, and stack 1 cord takes a man with a proper axe 8 hours. You have a hand axe. It would take you 3 times as long. You would need 200 hours of labor just for the wood to burn, and you would need a cabin to burn it in. And food. I understand the numbers. Do you?" His voice dropped. "A girl alone cannot cut enough timber to heat a proper cabin. You will die in that pile of rubbish, and no one will find your body until spring." The words hung in the air between them. Solvi felt them land like stones. "There is a Lutheran church in Merrill," Dag continued. "They can find you a placement. A family who needs kitchen help, perhaps. You would be warm. You would be fed. You would live. I have been placed." Solvi's voice was flat. "I know what it means." Something flickered in Dag's eyes. Recognition, perhaps? Or pity. He had daughters once. He understood what could happen to a girl alone in another family's house. "Then I will pray for you," he said finally, "because nothing else will save you." He turned and walked back into the trees. Solvi watched him go. Her hands were shaking, though the morning was warm. He was right about the numbers. She knew he was right. 8 cords of wood, 60 straight logs, 200 hours of labor with tools she did not have. The math was impossible. She looked at the slash field, at the crooked, knotty, hollow logs that no sawmill would touch. But before she turned back to the lean-to, she walked to the edge of the clearing where her father had carved his initials into a stump years ago. The letters were gray now, nearly swallowed by the bark growing over them. She ran her fingers across them, and beneath the stump, wedged into a gap between two roots, she found a tin box. Inside was a letter, her father's handwriting, careful and slanted. The first lines were clear. He wrote about the land, about the clay deposits along the creek, rich and deep, better than anything in the county, about a man named Grindy who knew. The rest of the letter was torn. The bottom half was missing. Whatever her father had meant to say about Grinda, whatever he had wanted her to know, was gone. Solvi folded the letter and pressed it against her chest. She did not understand what it meant, not yet. But she understood one thing with a certainty that went deeper than logic. This land had mattered to her father. He had hidden this letter because someone might come looking for it, and the name he had written, Grinda, belonged to the man who owned the only general store in Merrill, the man who sold flour and salt and nails to every homesteader within 30 miles. She put the letter back in the tin box and buried it beneath the hearthstone she would build, because she would build one. She would build walls and a roof and a door. She would build something from this field of rubbish that everyone said was worthless. She looked at the slash field one last time, at the crooked logs, the knotty logs, the hollow logs that no one wanted. "This is my home," she said, and no one answered. But the creek kept running, and the wind moved through the empty stumps, and somewhere in the distance, a bird called once and went silent. The idea came to her 3 days later in the gray hour before dawn. She had been stacking firewood, short pieces cut from waste logs with her hand axe. The pieces were uneven, some curved, some split, some barely longer than her forearm, but they stacked, end grain facing out. They locked together like a puzzle. She could build a wall of firewood half as high as her hip before it wobbled. She stood back and stared at the stack. The pieces were too short to build with. Everyone knew that. A cabin needed long logs laid horizontally, notched at the corners, stacked one atop another. What she had was cordwood, stove wood, fuel. But the stack was tight, solid. The end grain surfaces pressed against each other, and the irregular shapes interlocked rather than slipping apart. What if she mortared them? The thought came unbidden, and with it a memory she had nearly forgotten. Her grandmother back in Norway, before Solvi was born, describing the old way of building. Peasant houses in the mountains built from short pieces of wood and clay because they had no long timber. Vedmer, her grandmother called it. Wood walls. Solvi crouched beside her firewood stack and examined the gaps between pieces. Mud would fill them. Clay would be better. There was clay at the creek bank, gray and sticky and available for free. She could mix it with sand and sawdust, both of which lay in endless supply across the slash field. The mortar would lock the pieces in place. The wall would become solid. But would it keep out the cold? She thought about it for a long time, sitting beside her stack of waste wood while the sun rose over the slash field. A conventional log cabin wall was perhaps 8 inches thick, 1 log's diameter. The gaps between logs were stuffed with chinking that cracked and fell out every winter. Cold poured through the gaps. Everyone complained of it. Her stack was already 12 inches deep. the length of the pieces she had cut. If she cut them longer, 16 inches, the length of a standard firewood stick, the wall would be 16 inches thick, twice as thick as a log cabin. And there would be no gaps, because every gap would be filled with mortar. She walked to the creek bank and dug her fingers into the clay. It was dense and cold, the consistency of thick bread dough. She carried a double handful back to her firewood stack and pressed it into the gaps. The clay stuck. It held. She cut more pieces from a hollow log, the kind Dag had called garbage, and added another course on top. More clay, more sawdust. The wall rose another 8 inches. By midday, she had built a test section 3 feet high. It was ugly. The logs were mismatched, some round, some split, some barely thicker than her wrist. But the wall did not wobble. It did not lean. The mortar held the pieces like teeth in a jaw. She pushed against it with both hands. It did not move. She had not built anything. Not yet. A 3-foot test wall was not a cabin. But she had proven something to herself. And the proof changed everything. The twisted logs, the knotty logs, the hollow logs. They were not garbage. They were building material. And that was when the hunger began to bite. She had rationed the bread from the Hendricksons down to crumbs, then nothing. The $9 sewn into her hem could buy flour in Merrill, but Merrill was 12 miles south, and every hour spent walking was an hour not spent building. She set snares along the creek the way her father had shown her once, years ago, when she was small enough to sit on his knee and watch his hands work the wire. The snares caught nothing. 5 days passed. She drank creek water and chewed pine bark and told herself that hunger was only a feeling and feelings could be endured. But her hands shook when she lifted the axe. Her vision swam when she stood too quickly. She woke on the 6th morning and could not rise from her blanket for a long time. She lay there staring at the lean-to ceiling, at the branches and bark and gray sky beyond, and she thought about Merrill, about the Lutheran church and its clean floors and warm stoves, about placement, a family who needed kitchen help. She would be warm. She would be fed. She would live. What if Dag was right? The question sat in her chest like a stone. She had built a test wall, 3 feet of mortared waste wood that proved nothing except that clay stuck to timber. Winter was coming, and she had no cabin, no food, no tools worth the name, and her body was eating itself to stay alive. She could walk to Merrill. She could give up. She lay there for a long time. The morning light shifted across the lean-to floor. The creek murmured. A jay screamed somewhere in the stumps. Then she remembered something. Her father, kneeling beside the Tomahawk River, showing her where to set wire. Not across the trail, Solvi. Beside the water, where they come to drink at dawn. Low to the ground, loose. Let them walk into it. She had set her snares across the rabbit trails, every one of them. She had set them the way she thought they should go, not the way her father had taught her. She rose. She pulled the snares and reset them, low, along the creek bank, near the clay deposit where the ground was soft and the tracks were fresh. The next morning, there was a rabbit in the wire. She skinned it with the hand axe and roasted it over the coals and ate every piece, including the liver and heart, cracking the bones for marrow the way her mother had done in the years before food was plentiful. Her hands stopped shaking by afternoon. She mixed mortar and laid 2 courses before dark. "The skills you need are already inside you," her father's voice, or the memory of it, steady and patient. She did not nearly give up again, but she did not forget how close she had come. The cabin's footprint was 12 feet by 14, small but larger than she had first planned. The walls would consume an enormous amount of material. She calculated one night, scratching numbers in the dirt with a stick. Roughly 2,000 log ends for the entire structure. 2,000 pieces cut to 16-inch lengths, debarked, sorted by diameter, mortared into place. She had cut 300 by the end of the first week. Her hands blistered, then bled, then calloused into something that no longer felt like hands. Her shoulders ached constantly. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, her dress hanging looser each week. When she caught her reflection in the creek, she saw a stranger, gaunt, hollow-eyed, years older than Fortin. But the walls rose. By the 20th of September, they stood 2 feet high, a rectangle of mortared log ends, solid and ugly and undeniably real. She walked around it in the evening light and felt something she had not felt in months. Not hope, exactly, but possibility. Berta Haugen arrived on the 4th of September riding a draft horse that had seen better decades. She was a Norwegian widow in her mid-30s, with hands as rough as any man's and eyes that missed nothing. She homesteaded 2 miles north, running her claim alone with 2 sons since her husband had been killed by a falling tree in '85. She had heard about the Asmundsen girl. Everyone had. Solvi was mixing mortar when the horse appeared at the edge of the clearing. A thick slurry of clay, sand, and sawdust that stuck to her arms up to the elbows. Behind her, the first course of her cabin wall rose 8 inches above the foundation. 16-inch log pieces mortared in place. End grain facing out. A wall of firewood. Berta climbed down from her horse and walked slowly around the foundation. Her expression revealed nothing. "What is this?" she asked finally. "A cabin? This is not a cabin. This is a wood pile." Solvi continued mixing. "The pieces are too short to rot. The mortar seals the gaps. The wall will be 16 inches thick when it is done." 16 inches of what? Firewood? Berta shook her head. "I built a cabin with my husband. I know how walls are made. You cannot stack cordwood and call it a house. My grandmother built this way in Norway. Your grandmother is not here. And this is not Norway. This is Wisconsin, and the winters here will kill you." Berta crouched beside the test wall and ran her fingers along the mortar lines. She pushed against it as Solvi had done. It did not move. "The mortar will crack," Berta said. "When the freeze comes, the water in the clay will expand. The mortar will split and fall out. By December, you will have gaps you can put your fist through. I mix lime with the clay. It slows the cracking. And when the wind blows, when a January gale hits these walls at 40 miles per hour, the mortar goes all the way through. There are no gaps for wind to find." Berta stood. She looked at the slash field, then at Solvi, then at the wall rising from the foundation. Something in her face shifted, not belief, but uncertainty. She had been sure this was foolishness. Now she was not sure. You are betting your life on this, she said. Yes. If it fails, you will have no cabin and no time to build another. I know, and you will die. I know. Berta was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into her saddlebag and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. She set it on a stump. Dried venison, she said. I have more than I need. I cannot pay you. I am not asking for payment. I am asking you to not die on my conscience. She climbed back onto her horse. I will come back in a month. If you are still alive, I will bring more. She turned the horse toward the trail. At the tree line, she stopped and looked back. The walls will not hold, she said, but I hope I am wrong. Then she paused. My youngest boy, Burger. He is 9 years old and has no school. If you survive the month, you will teach him to read. 1 afternoon a week. That is my price. Then she was gone. Solvi unwrapped the venison. It was good meat, properly dried, enough to last a week if she was careful. Charity given with rough hands and a doubting heart. She ate a small piece and went back to mixing mortar. Birger Haugen came the following Tuesday. He arrived on foot, walking the 2 miles from his mother's homestead with a slate tucked under one arm and a look of profound skepticism on his face. He was 9 years old, tall for his age, quiet in the way of children who have learned that the world does not always explain itself. He stood at the edge of the clearing and stared at the walls rising from the foundation. Then he walked closer. Then he touched the mortar with one finger, the way a person touches something they do not quite believe is real. Is this a house? He asked. It will be. It looks like a wood pile. Solvi almost smiled. Your mother said the same thing. She gave him his first lesson that afternoon, sitting on a stump with the slate between them while the mortar dried. He learned the alphabet in 2 sittings. By the 3rd visit, he was sounding out words. By the 4th, he was reading sentences, slowly, with his finger tracking beneath each word, his lips moving silently. He began calling the cabin the warm house, before it had any warmth in it at all. And he began bringing things. A handful of nails from his mother's barn, a piece of rope, once a jar of pickled beets that he carried 2 miles without dropping. For the warm house, he said each time. And each time Solvi thanked him and put the offering on the growing shelf inside the unfinished walls. It was Birger who found the dog. He came running into the clearing one Tuesday afternoon with mud on his knees and panic in his eyes. There is a dog in the dump, he said. The old logging dump near the creek. Someone left it there. It is so thin I can count every rib. Solvi did not want a dog. She could barely feed herself. Another mouth was foolishness she could not afford. Please, Birger said. Please, it will die if we leave it. She went to look. The dog was huddled beneath a collapsed timber frame, a medium-sized mutt with matted fur and eyes that had given up expecting kindness. It did not growl when Solvi approached. It did not wag its tail. It simply looked at her and waited to see what would happen next. She recognized the look. She had worn it herself the day Mr. Hendrickson handed her $9 and told her to leave. Come on, then, she said. The dog followed her back to the clearing and lay down beside the unfinished wall as though it had always lived there. Birger named it Cora, after a dog his father had owned before the tree fell. That night, for the first time since Solvi had come to the slash field, something slept beside her. Cora curled against her back, bony and warm, and the sound of its breathing filled the lean-to like a second heartbeat. She had not realized how loud the silence had been until it was gone. Cora became a guardian before the week was out. It slept across the doorway of the lean-to. It growled low in its throat when strangers approached. It followed Solvi to the creek and back, to the mortar pit and back, to the slash piles and back. A shadow that never wandered far. And when Birger came for his lessons, Cora lay beside them with its chin on its paws, and sighed with a contentment so deep that Birger laughed out loud. It was the first time Solvi had heard a child laugh in the clearing. But what Solvi did not know was that someone else had been watching her progress, and his visit would change everything she understood about her father's death. Dag Kvernmo returned on a morning in late October. He appeared at the tree line the same way he had the first time. Heavy footsteps, gray beard, hands like oak roots. But this time he carried something. He walked to the edge of the clearing and stopped. The walls stood 4 feet high now, mortared log ends, 16 inches thick, rising from a foundation of dry stacked stone. Ugly as sin, and solid enough to stop a charging horse. Dag looked at the walls for a long time. He did not speak. Then he walked to a stump near the cabin and set down what he was carrying. It was an axe, full size, the handle worn smooth by years of use, the head sharp and clean. "The axe was your father's," he said. "He left it at my cabin the week before he died. I should have returned it sooner." Solvi stared at the axe. Her father's hands had held that handle. His sweat had worn the wood smooth. She reached for it and felt the weight of it settle into her grip, and for a moment he was standing beside her. Dag turned to leave. He did not comment on the walls. He did not say she would survive, but at the tree line, he paused. "The walls are 4 feet, he said. "Yes, they need to be 7. I know." Then he was gone. He had not apologized. He had not admitted he was wrong. But he had brought her father's axe across 2 miles of forest. And that was something. The walls rose faster now. The full-size axe cut through waste timber in half the time, 10 inches a day when the weather held. The first frost came on the 28th of September. She woke to white crystals on the grass and her breath visible in the air. The message was clear. Summer was gone. She worked faster. 12 inches a day. She stopped eating midday meals to save time. She cut corners on debarking, leaving bark in place when the logs were sound. The walls grew ragged and uneven, but they grew. She ran out of flour on the 18th of October and walked to Merrill to buy more. The general store stood on the main street, the largest building in town, and the man who owned it stood behind the counter as though he owned the town as well. Niels Grinde, thick, small-eyed, the confidence of someone who had never gone hungry. "You are the girl in the slash field," he said, "building the rubbish pile. I need flour and salt. I have heard about your cabin." He leaned on the counter. "That land is not yours, you know. The timber rights were sold to the company. When they abandoned the claim, it reverted to the county. You are trespassing. The county has not objected. Not yet. But I have written to them. A child cannot hold property. When you freeze this winter, and you will freeze, I will not be responsible for what happens to that land. I had plans for it before you arrived." Solvi set her coins on the counter, flour and salt. Grindy took his time filling the order. "The sheriff may come to visit you," he said as she gathered her purchases. "Before the snow. To remove you from property that is not yours. Then I will be gone before the snow. You will be gone before spring. One way or another." He smiled without warmth. "Dead or departed. The land does not care which." But then he said something else. Something that stopped Solvy's hand on the door. "Your father had the same foolish idea about this land. Look where it got him." The words hit her like a slap. She turned. Grinday was wiping the counter with a rag, his face blank, as though he had said nothing of consequence. "What do you mean?" "I mean that land has buried better people than you. Good day." She walked back to the slash field with the flour heavy on her back and Grinday's words heavier in her mind. Your father had the same foolish idea. Look where it got him. Her father had died in a logging accident, a falling tree. Everyone said so. But Grinday had spoken as though he knew something more, as though the land itself was the reason. She thought about the letter in the tin box. Grinday knows, the torn second half that might explain everything. But she could not chase answers now. She had to finish the walls. She had to survive the winter. Everything else was a problem for spring, if she lived until spring. Then the sheriff came. Nyquist rode into the clearing on the first day of November with Niels Grinda beside him. The walls stood 5 feet high. Solvy was laying mortar on the 6th course when she heard the horses. Cora growled low. Berger, who had come for his Tuesday lesson, stood up from the stump where he was reading and moved closer to Solvy without being told. "Miss Asmundsen," the sheriff said. He did not dismount. "You are occupying county land without authorization. Mr. Grinda has filed a formal complaint." "I was born in this county," Solvy said. "My father worked this land. Your father held no deed. The timber company held the rights. When they left, the land reverted to public ownership. You have no legal claim." Grinday leaned forward in his saddle. "I have offered to purchase the parcel from the county. 20 acres at fair price. The board meets in December." The sheriff looked uncomfortable. He was not a cruel man, but he was a man who followed rules. "Miss Asmundsen, I am advising you to vacate before the first snow. If the county sells the land to Mr. Grinda, you will be removed by force." Solvy looked at Grinda. His face was smooth, patient, the face of a man who had already won and was simply waiting for the formality. "And my father?" she said. "Did he vacate too?" Something moved behind Grinda's eyes. A flicker, fast as a snake, and gone just as quickly. "Your father died in an accident," he said. "Everyone knows that." "Everyone knows," Solvy repeated. "But you know something else." "Do you not, Mr. Grinda?" Grinday said nothing. The sheriff shifted in his saddle. "You have until the snow," the sheriff said. "I am sorry." They rode away. Birger stood beside Solvy, still holding his slate. Cora pressed against her leg. The clearing felt emptier than it had before, though nothing had changed. That night she sat inside the unfinished walls and stared at the fire. The sheriff would come back. Grinday would buy the land. She had no legal standing, no money for a lawyer, no adults who would speak for her. She was 14 years old, and the law did not care about grandmother's building techniques or father's hidden letters. She could leave, walk to Merrill, find placement, warm kitchen, full stomach. Someone else's house, someone else's rules, someone else's hands in the dark. She sat with that thought for a long time. Cora lay beside her, his head on her knee. In the morning, Berger came early. He stood in the doorway with his slate and a bundle from his mother. "Potatoes and smoked fish. Are you leaving?" he asked. Solvi looked at him. 9 years old. No school for 30 miles. Reading for the first time in his life because a girl in a trash cabin had taught him the alphabet on a stump. "I do not know," she said. Berger set the slate on the ground. He sat down cross-legged beside Cora and put his hand on the dog's back. "But who will teach me to read if you go?" The words were simple. A child's question, without strategy or manipulation. He did not know he was saving her. He only knew that he had found a teacher, and he did not want to lose her. Solvi picked up the slate and handed it to him. "Page 12, she said. Third paragraph. Read it out loud." She was not leaving. The walls reached 5 feet by the 1st of November. Then 6. The full-size axe her father had once held made the cutting faster. Solvi fell into a rhythm that consumed her. Wake before dawn. Mix mortar while the light was gray. Lay courses until her arms shook. Cut more pieces from the slash piles. Stack them to dry. Mix more mortar. Lay more courses. Stop when she could no longer see. She found the second part of her father's letter on a Thursday. She had been pulling boards from a collapsed logging shack a quarter mile from the clearing, scavenging material for the doorframe. The shack had been built by the timber company and abandoned with everything else. Most of it was rotted through, but the door frame was sound, and she needed it. She was pulling a board from the wall when a folded paper fell from a gap between the studs. It was yellowed and brittle, but the handwriting was the same. Her father's, careful and slanted. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The letter was the second half of the one she had found in the tin box, or perhaps a different letter entirely. But it continued the story. Her father had found the clay deposits along the creek. Rich clay, deep and pure, good enough for brick making. He had told his partner about it. His partner was Niels Grinde. They had agreed to file a joint claim after the logging company left. But Grinde had gone to the timber company instead. He had told them that her father was violating the terms of his work contract by prospecting on company land. The company fired her father, without references. In the middle of logging season, when every other crew was full, her father had taken the only work he could find. Dangerous work. Clearing slash on a steep hillside where the timber was unstable. The tree fell on the 11th of June, 1886. Her father died the same day. Grinde filed his first inquiry about the land 2 weeks later. "If anything happens to me," her father had written, "the land is Solvi's. Grinde owes me. He owes me everything." Solvi sat in the ruins of the logging shack with the letter in her lap and the afternoon light falling through the broken roof. She did not cry. She had stopped crying months ago, but something hardened inside her. A resolve that went past stubbornness into something older and quieter. Grinde had not killed her father, not directly, but he had taken the ground out from under him. He had traded a man's livelihood for a chance at 20 acres of clay, and now he was doing the same thing to the man's daughter. She folded the letter carefully. She carried it back to the clearing and placed it on the shelf beside the first one, where Berger's jar of pickled beets sat next to a coil of rope and a handful of nails. She did not show the letter to anyone. Not yet. She had no proof beyond a dead man's words. And proof did not matter if she froze before spring. She went back to mixing mortar. On the 10th of November, she moved inside. The cabin was not finished. The door was a salvaged plank propped against the opening. The window was greased paper stretched over a square hole. The floor was bare earth packed hard by her footsteps. The chimney was half built, a crooked column of clay-mortared stones that rose 6 feet above a hole in the roof. But it was shelter. Walls on 4 sides, a roof overhead, a space that was hers. She built her first fire inside on the 12th of November. The smoke did not draw well. It pooled against the ceiling and made her eyes water until she adjusted the chimney height. But the heat stayed. She felt it accumulating in the thick walls, radiating back at her like warmth from a sun-baked stone. By evening, the temperature outside had dropped to 20 degrees above zero. Inside, near the fire, it was 50, maybe 55. Berta Haugen had been wrong. The walls held. Berta returned on the 20th of November. She rode into the clearing and stopped her horse, staring at the cabin that had not existed 8 weeks before. Solvi emerged from the doorway, a real doorway now, and waited. Berta climbed down slowly. She walked around the cabin once, twice, running her hands along the mortared walls. She pressed her palm against the surface and held it there. "It is warm," she said. "The wall is warm. The fire has been burning for 8 days. The heat soaks into the mortar and the wood. It radiates back all night, even when the fire burns low." Berta said nothing for a long moment. Then she looked at Solvi. "I said the mortar would crack and fall out by December. I said the wind would blow straight through. I said you were building a wood pile and not a house." "Yes." Berta reached into her saddlebag. Potatoes and venison. She set them on the stump. "Birger reads now," she said. "He reads to his brother at night. I hear them through the wall." She paused. "He calls this the warm house. He has called it that since September, before you even had a roof." Solvi felt something loosen in her chest. "The walls will hold all winter," she said. "The mortar is solid. The sawdust cavity in the center traps the heat." Berta looked at her with an expression Solvi had never seen before. Not doubt, not belief. Something in between. "If they hold," she said. "If they hold through January. Then I was wrong about everything." She mounted her horse and rode away. December came. The temperature swung between 10 above and 20 below zero. But inside, always inside, the temperature held between 45 and 55 degrees. Solvi burned perhaps a quarter cord of wood in the entire month. She had expected to burn a full cord. The walls were doing something she had not fully understood when she built them. The thick mortar and dense log ends absorbed heat during the day when the fire burned hot. At night, when she banked the coals and slept, the walls released that heat slowly, steadily, keeping the cabin warm even as the fire died down to embers. Thermal mass, a builder might have called it, if Solvi had known the term. She only knew that she woke each morning to a cabin that was cold but not freezing, and her firewood pile was shrinking far more slowly than she had feared. Stellan Lindahl appeared in the second week of December. He was Swedish, not Norwegian, which in the social geography of northern Wisconsin was a distinction that mattered to everyone except the cold. He was perhaps 20 years old, rangy and quiet, with the calloused hands of a man who had spent his life in timber. He had heard about the cabin. Everyone had. He came to see if it was true. He stood in the clearing and looked at the walls for a long time without speaking. Then he walked closer. He pressed his hand against the mortar the way everyone did. He looked at the 16-inch depth of the wall. He looked at the chimney, the roof, the plank door. "How much firewood have you burned?" he asked. "A quarter cord. In the entire month." Stellan was quiet. Then he said something no one else had said. "The roof pitch is too shallow. You will lose heat through the ceiling faster than through the walls. I can help you add insulation if you have cedar bark to spare." He came back the next day with tools. He did not ask permission. He simply appeared at dawn and began stripping bark from deadfalls along the creek. By afternoon, he had added a second layer to the roof, packed with dried moss and sawdust between the layers. The cabin temperature rose 3 degrees that night. He came back the day after that, and the day after that. Birger noticed before Solvi did. "He keeps coming back," Birger said during his Tuesday lesson. His voice was matter-of-fact, the way children speak when they have observed something obvious that adults are pretending not to see. "I think he likes you." "Read the next paragraph," Solvi said. And her face was warm, though the fire was low. Dag Kvernmo came by in the last week of December. He stood outside her door in the falling snow and looked at the cabin walls with an expression Solvi could not read. "You are alive," he said. "Yes." The walls did not fall. "No." He nodded slowly. He did not apologize for his prediction, but something in his posture had shifted. He was not certain anymore. "It has not been truly cold yet," he said. "Wait until January. Wait until the real storms come. Then we will see what your walls can do." He walked away into the snow. Solvi watched him go. She knew he was right. December had been mild by Wisconsin standards. The real cold, the killing cold, had not yet arrived. But she had made it to December. Her firewood pile still held over 3 cords. Birger could read. Cora slept beside the fire each night and sighed with a contentment so deep it sounded like prayer. And Stellan Lindahl kept finding reasons to come back. Birger asked on the last Tuesday before Christmas. He was sitting on this cabin floor with Cora's head in his lap, the slate balanced on his knee. Snow was falling outside. The fire crackled. The walls radiated their quiet warmth. "Solvi, are you poor?" She looked around the cabin. At the walls she had built with her own cracked hands. At the shelf, with its jar of pickled beets and coil of rope, and 2 letters from a dead man. At the dog who had come from the dump, and the boy who had come from 2 miles north, and the fire that had not gone out since November. "No," she said. "We have everything that matters." Birger accepted this. He went back to his reading. Cora sighed. The snow fell, and somewhere outside, the real winter was gathering itself for what it would do next. January arrived with false kindness. The first week was cold but clear, temperatures hovering around 0. The second week warmed unexpectedly, climbing into the 20s. Solvi opened her door for the first time in a month and felt something almost like hope. Then the 11th came and the temperature soared. She woke to dripping. Water ran from the icicles on her eaves, pooling in the snow below. She stepped outside and felt air that belonged to March, not January. Warm, wet, wrong. The thermometer Berta had lent her read 44 degrees above zero. She spent the morning checking her snare lines and assessing her supplies. 3.5 cords of firewood remained, more than enough for February and March at her current rate of consumption. Her food stores were adequate. Potatoes, dried venison, flour. The rabbits she caught. She had survived December. She would survive the rest. But something felt wrong. The warmth was too sudden, too complete. The old-timers in Merrill had a saying: when January feels like April, February comes in January. But what Solvi did not know was that the warmth had changed more than the weather. It had changed Stellan Lindahl's position entirely. Stellan stopped coming. He did not appear on the 12th, or the 13th, or the 14th. After 10 days of daily visits, the clearing was empty. Solvi told herself it meant nothing. He was a logger. Loggers worked. The warm spell meant passable roads and timber to haul. But on the 15th, Berger arrived for his Tuesday lesson with a face that told her everything. Stellan is not coming back, Berger said. He set his slate on the stump and did not sit down. Mr. Grinda told him that anyone who trades with the trash cabin will not trade at the store. Stellan buys his supplies from Mr. Grinda. Everyone does. There is no other store. Solvi absorbed this. She had known Grinda was powerful. She had not fully understood what that meant until now. In a town with one general store, the man who owned the store owned the town. He could cut anyone off. And he had chosen to cut off the one person who had been helping her most. Did Stellan say anything? She asked. Berger looked at his shoes. He said he was sorry. He said he could not fight, Mr. Grinda. He said he hoped you would understand. Solvi understood. She understood perfectly. Stellan was not a coward. He was a man with no leverage, and Grinda had all of it: flour, salt, nails, kerosene. The things that kept you alive through a Wisconsin winter. You did not cross the man who sold them. That was the first departure. The second came from the pulpit. Reverend Stenberg preached that Sunday about the sin of pride. Berger told her about it the following Tuesday, recounting the words with the precision of a boy who had recently learned to read and now listened to language differently. He said that a young woman in the parish had set herself above the wisdom of her elders, Berger reported. He said she was building a monument to vanity and that God would not be mocked. He said the community should pray for her repentance. He meant you, Berger added. In case that was not clear. It was clear. The third blow came from Mrs. Voss. Mrs. Voss was the wife of the feed merchant and the informal communications network of Merrill. What she said at the dry goods counter on Monday was established truth by Friday. And what she said that week was that the Norwegian girl in the slash field was living in improper circumstances. A young woman, alone, receiving visits from an unmarried man. No chaperone, no family, no decency. The fact that Stellan had stopped visiting did not matter. The rumor had already been built and furnished and moved into. Berta Haugen heard it all. She said nothing to Solvi directly, but she stopped riding to the clearing. Berger still came for his lessons, walking the 2 miles alone, but his mother no longer accompanied the food she sent. The packages appeared in Berger's hands without comment or message. Solvi had been alone before. She had been alone the day she walked into the slash field with $9 and a hand axe. But this was different, Before, she had been alone because no one knew her. Now she was alone because everyone had decided what she was. The clearing felt smaller. The walls felt closer. Cora slept beside her each night, and Birger came on Tuesdays, and the fire burned. But the silence between visits was louder than it had been in autumn. She sat in the cabin one night after Birger had gone home, staring at her father's letters on the shelf. Two halves of a truth that could destroy Niels Grinda. Proof that he had betrayed her father. Proof that he had caused the accident that killed him. But proof meant nothing without a voice to speak it. She was 14. She was a girl. She was the trash cabin girl who lived in improper circumstances. No court in the county would hear her. No sheriff would act on a dead man's letter against the man who supplied the town. She put the letters back on the shelf and fed the fire. She was still alone when Birger arrived the following Tuesday with something other than his slate. He handed her a folded paper. "My mother told me to give you this. She said not to open it until you are inside." Solvi took it inside. Corey watched from his place beside the fire. She unfolded the paper. It was a deed. A county land deed for 20 acres, including the slash field and the creek and the meadow where her cabin stood. Purchased from the county board for $14 plus filing fees. Filed in the name of Berta Haugen, to be held in trust for Solvi Asmundsen until her 21st birthday. There was a note in Berta's careful handwriting. The board met early. Grinda bid $12. I bid $14. The board preferred cash in hand to promises. I am holding this land because a child cannot own property in Wisconsin. When you are 21, it transfers to your name. I have written it into my will. Do not thank me. Pay me back when you can. And do not die on my land, because someone should own this ground who understands what can be built from what others throw away. Solvi read the note 3 times. Then she pressed it against her chest the way she had pressed her father's letter months before. Berta had not come to the clearing. She had not spoken to Solvi directly. She had not defended her against Reverend Stenberg or Mrs. Voss or the Whisper Network that had cut Stellan off and pushed Solvi to the margins. But she had walked into the county board meeting and outbid Niels Grinda for 20 acres of slash field. And she had done it quietly, without announcement, sending the deed through the hands of a 9-year-old boy. The land was safe, for now. But Grindy was not the kind of man who lost quietly, and the winter, the real winter, had not yet shown its hand. Solvi walked to her fishing lines at the creek on the morning of the 10th and met an Ojibwe elder coming the other way. She had seen him once before, passing through the slash field in autumn. He had not spoken to her then. He spoke to her now. He stopped when he saw her and pointed toward the northwest sky. "Bad storm coming," he said. "Birds know. Muskrats know. Stay inside when sky turns green." Solvi looked at the sky. It was blue, cloudless, beautiful. "When?" she asked. The old man shrugged. "Soon. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe tonight. The animals have been moving south for 3 days. The muskrats sealed their lodges a week ago." He looked at her cabin across the clearing. "Your walls are thick. That is good." He continued down the trail without looking back. Solvi returned to the cabin and brought in an extra armload of firewood. She checked the door, checked the chimney, checked the grease paper over her window. Everything was secure. Everything was ready. But the town was not ready. And no one would listen to the trash cabin girl. She went anyway. She walked 12 miles to Merrill on the morning of the 11th. The temperature was 44 degrees. The snow was melting. Children played in the streets. She went to the general store first because that was where people gathered. "A storm is coming," she said. "The Ojibwe elder warned me. The birds are flying wrong. The animals are moving south." Niels Grinda leaned on his counter and smiled. "The trash girl is scared of sunshine," he said. The men at the counter laughed. She went to the church. Reverend Stenberg listened with his hands folded and his face patient and closed. "Only God knows the weather, child. We should not put our faith in the superstitions of savages." She went to the sheriff's office. Nyquist was polite but dismissive. "I appreciate your concern, Miss Asmundsen, but we cannot shut down the town because an Indian told you the birds looked funny." She went to the schoolhouse. The teacher, a young woman from Milwaukee, looked at the clear sky and the warm air and shook her head. "The children are going home at the regular time. I will not alarm their parents over a feeling." Solvi stood in the street and looked at the faces around her. Farmers loading wagons, women shopping, children running between buildings, every one of them confident, every one of them wrong. She thought about going door to door. She thought about shouting. She thought about standing in the middle of the street and screaming until someone listened. But she had learned something in the months since August. You cannot make people hear what they have decided not to believe. You can only build your walls thick enough to survive what comes. She walked back to the slash field. 12 miles in warm January air that felt like a held breath. She brought in every piece of firewood she could carry. She filled the water bucket. She sealed the gaps around the door with rags. She cooked a pot of stew from the last of Berta's venison and the potatoes Berger had brought. Cora would not settle. He paced from the door to the fire and back, whining low in his throat. He would not sit. He would not lie down. His ears moved constantly, tracking something Solvi could not hear. She knew what it meant. She had known since the Ojibwe elder pointed at the sky. She checked the thermometer, 44 degrees. She opened the door and looked northwest. The sky was clear. The sun was setting. The world was warm and still and absolutely wrong. She closed the door. She sat beside the fire. She waited. The morning of January 12th, 1888, dawned warmer still. By noon, the thermometer read 46 degrees. Solvi opened her door to air out the cabin, something she had not done in months. The warmth felt miraculous. She walked to her woodpile to count the remaining cords. 3.5, maybe a bit more. Plenty. She was standing by the wood stack, her back to the northwest, when the world changed. First the sound. A roar, like a distant waterfall growing louder. Then the wind died completely. Suddenly, as if someone had closed a door, Solvi turned. The horizon had vanished. Where sky should have been, there was a wall, black and green and churning. It stretched from the ground to the heavens and moved toward her faster than a horse could run. She had perhaps 30 seconds. She ran. The wind hit her before she reached the door. It knocked her flat, drove the breath from her lungs, filled her eyes with ice. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in the time it took her to stand. 30 degrees by the time she crawled toward where the cabin should be. She could not see. She could not breathe. The cold was a living thing clawing at her exposed skin, her thin dress, her unprotected hands. She had not grabbed her coat. She had stepped outside in the warm weather wearing nothing but wool. She was going to die 30 feet from her door. Her hands struck something solid. Wood. The firewood stack. She followed it piece by piece toward the south wall. The wall. The door. She found the latch by feel, wrenched it open, fell inside. The door slammed behind her. Cora was already there, pressed against the far wall, trembling. The stove had banked coals. She had left them burning low. She crawled toward the heat, fed the fire with shaking hands, watched the flames catch and grow. Outside, the sound was like a freight train that never passed. The children's blizzard had arrived. The first hour was the worst. She fed the fire until it roared, but her body would not stop shaking. Her fingers had gone white, then red, then a mottled purple that frightened her more than the cold. She had been outside for perhaps 3 minutes. 3 minutes without a coat in wind that cut like razors. She knew what frostbite looked like. She had seen Dag Kvernmo's scarred hands. She held her fingers near the flames until the pain became unbearable, then pulled them back, then held them close again. Feeling returned slowly. First a tingling, then an ache, then the sharp bite of blood flowing back into damaged tissue. Her ears burned, her nose ran. Her feet, still in their boots, felt like blocks of wood. But she was inside, and the fire was burning, and the walls were holding. She pressed her palm against the interior surface as Berta Haugen had done in November. The mortar was cool, but not cold. The log ends felt almost warm compared to the howling nightmare outside. 16 inches of wood and clay and sawdust stood between her and a wind that could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. She checked the thermometer. Inside, 41 degrees. Cold, but survivable. She added more wood to the fire and watched the needle climb. 44, 47, 50. Outside, the storm screamed like a living thing. The blizzard lasted 36 hours. Solvi did not sleep the first night. She sat by the fire and fed it steadily, listening to the wind tear at her roof and batter her walls. Snow found its way through gaps she had thought were sealed. Tiny drifts accumulated in corners along the window frame beneath the door. She stuffed rags into the cracks and watched the drifts stop growing. The temperature outside dropped with terrifying speed. At 9 in the evening, it was 11 degrees below zero. At midnight, 30 below. By dawn on the 13th, the thermometer outside her door read 42 degrees below zero. Inside, the cabin held 52 degrees. Cor had stopped trembling. He lay beside the fire with his chin on his paws, watching Solvi with eyes that trusted her completely. She did not understand the physics of what was happening, but she could feel it. The thick walls absorbed heat from the fire and released it slowly, steadily, even when the flames burned low. The sawdust cavity in the center of the wall created a barrier that the cold could not penetrate. The mass of wood and clay acted like a stone that had been warmed by the sun, radiating heat long after the source was gone. She burned a quarter cord of firewood in the first 24 hours. A conventional cabin would have consumed a full cord and still struggled to stay above freezing. 42 below zero outside, 52 above inside. The trash cabin held, and then, through the roar of the wind, she heard something else, a sound that did not belong to the storm. Knocking. At first she thought she was imagining it. The wind played tricks. It howled and screamed and sometimes sounded almost human. But Cora lifted his head. His ears moved forward. He stared at the door. The knocking came again. Harder. Solvi stood. She crossed to the door and pressed her ear against the plank. Through the wood, through the wind, she heard a voice. Faint, desperate. Please, please let us in. She opened the door. The wind hit her like a wall of knives. Snow drove into the cabin in a horizontal sheet. She could not see beyond the doorframe, but she could see shapes, 2 adults, 3 children. The adults were carrying the youngest. The children were blue. It was Halverson, the farmer who lived 4 miles south, his wife, his 3 children. Their cabin roof had collapsed under the snow. They had walked through the storm for an hour. The youngest child was not moving. Solvi pulled them inside. She closed the door against the howling dark. Then the knocking came again. Mrs. Voss, the gossip woman, the woman who had told the town that Solvi lived in improper circumstances. She stood in the doorway with her 3-year-old son pressed against her chest and her face so raw from the wind that the skin had split along her cheekbones. She could not speak. She could only hold out the child. "Come in," Solvi said. "Get warm." Then the Reverend Stenberg. His church had lost its windows in the first hour of the storm. He had wrapped himself in altar cloths and walked half a mile through the dark. He was shaking so badly he could not stand. Then the widow Angstrom, 53 years old, alone. Her cabin had held for a while, but the fire went out and she could not relight it with frozen hands. Then a family of 4 whose names Solvi did not know. Germans from the south end of town. The father had frostbite on both ears. The mother was carrying twins. Then, hours later, when the storm was at its worst and the cabin held 16 people and the fire burned steady and the walls radiated their impossible warmth, one more knock. Solvi opened the door. Niels Grinda stood in the wind. He was not alone. He held his daughter against his chest. She was 7 years old. Her lips were the color of a bruise. Her eyes were closed. Her body was limp. Grindy's face was a thing Solvi had never seen before. Not cruel, not confident, not smooth. It was the face of a man who had run out of everything except fear. He did not say please. He did not say sorry. He looked at Solvi, and he looked at his daughter, and he could not form the word. Solvi looked at the girl in his arms, 7 years old, blue lips, still body. A child who had done nothing wrong except be born to a father who tried to destroy the only shelter that could save her. "Come in," Solvi said. "Get warm." Grinde stepped inside. The door closed. 18 people now in a cabin 12 feet by 14. Built from waste wood and creek clay and the memory of a grandmother's voice. And on the shelf, beside the jar of pickled beets and the coil of rope, sat 2 letters written by a dead man. Letters that the man now kneeling on the floor had every reason to fear. Grinde saw them. Solvi saw him see them. Their eyes met across the crowded cabin. Firelight on every face, wind screaming outside, his daughter limp in his arm. "Did you know what happened to my father?" Solvi asked. The cabin went quiet. Even the wind seemed to pause. Grinde looked at the letters. He looked at Solvi. He looked at his daughter. He did not answer. But his face answered for him. Every line of it, every shadow. The guilt was so plain it might have been written in the same careful hand as the letters themselves. Solvi held his gaze for a long moment, then she turned away. "Give me the child," she said. "I need to warm her slowly, not near the fire. The blood has to come back on its own." She took Grinda's daughter and carried her to the warmest corner of the cabin, where the wall radiated steady heat. She wrapped the girl in her own blanket. She held her hands and rubbed them gently, the way her grandmother had described, slowly, slowly, letting the blood return without shocking the heart. The girl's eyelids fluttered. Outside, the storm raged. Inside, the trash cabin held 52 degrees and 18 souls. And the man who had said dead or departed, "The land does not care which," knelt on the packed earth floor and watched a 14-year-old girl save his daughter's life with hands that he had tried to take everything from. The first night was the longest. 18 people in a space built for one. The air was thick with breath and sweat and the sharp smell of wet wool drying near the fire. Bodies pressed against bodies. Children whimpered in their sleep. Someone coughed in the darkness, and the sound echoed off the mortared walls like a stone dropped in a well. Solvi did not sleep. She moved through the cabin in the firelight, stepping over legs and around huddled forms, feeding the stove every hour. The firewood pile inside the door shrank steadily. She had brought in enough for 3 days when she was alone. With 18 people breathing the air and needing warmth, the math had changed entirely. She calculated in her head, 2 days of wood. Maybe 2.5 if she kept the fire low between feedings and let the walls do the work they were designed to do. The thick mortar and dense log ends had been absorbing heat for months. They would release it slowly through the night, even if the fire burned to embers. She did not need to roar the flames. She only needed to keep them alive. The Halverson children slept in a pile near the south wall, tangled together like puppies in a box. The youngest, the girl who had not been moving when they arrived, was breathing now. Shallow breaths, but steady ones. Solvi had warmed her the way she had warmed Grinda's daughter. Slowly, patiently. No direct heat. Hands wrapped in cloth, held between her own hands. The blood allowed to return at its own pace without shocking the heart. Her grandmother had taught her mother this. Her mother had taught her. The knowledge had traveled across an ocean and through 3 generations and arrived in a cabin in Wisconsin at the exact moment it was needed. You do not put frozen hands near the fire. The sudden heat drives warm blood into tissue that cannot receive it. The heart struggles. Sometimes the heart stops. You warm them slowly, with your own body heat, with the steady patience of someone who understands that survival is not speed. It is endurance. She had not known she was carrying this knowledge until the first frozen child was placed in her arms. Then it was there, complete and certain, as though her grandmother were standing beside her in the firelight, guiding her hands. Halverson sat against the east wall with his wife's head on his shoulder. He had not spoken since he arrived. His eyes were open and fixed on the fire with the 1,000-yard stare of a man reliving a catastrophe. His cabin roof collapsing, the sound of timbers breaking in the wind, his wife screaming, his hands grabbing children in the dark, running into nothing, into white, into cold that tore the breath from his lungs and the feeling from his fingers, running toward the only light he could find, which was the light in a trash cabin window half a mile through the storm. His wife stirred against his shoulder. "How much wood do we have?" she whispered. "Enough," Solvi said. It was not quite a lie. It was not quite the truth. It was the answer you give when the truth would help no one. And the only fuel more important than firewood is hope. She divided the food at dawn of the second day. Potatoes cut thin enough to see through. Venison broth stretched with snowmelt until it was barely more than warmth, with a memory of meat. Flour mixed with creek water and baked flat on the stovetop, each piece no larger than a child's palm. 18 portions from supplies meant for one girl and one dog. No one complained. No one asked for seconds. They ate what they were given with a gratitude so heavy it sat in the cabin like a 19th person, silent and enormous. She organized the space the way her father had organized a logging camp. Sleeping shifts, so that those who could sit upright gave floor space to those who needed to lie down. Children in the warmest corners near the walls where the thermal mass radiated steadily through the night. Adults along the center where the air was cooler but the fire was closer. The sick and the frozen nearest to Solvi, where she could check their fingers and watch their breathing and listen for the changes that signaled either recovery or the beginning of the end. Grinde sat in the far corner with Ingrid asleep against his chest. He had not spoken a word since Solvi had asked him about her father. He had not moved from the corner. He sat with his back against the wall and his arms around his daughter, and his eyes on the 2 letters that rested on the shelf above the stove. He watched them the way a man watches a loaded gun, knowing what they contain, knowing what they can do. Ingrid woke in the middle of the first morning. She was 7 years old, and she did not understand where she was or why so many people were lying on the floor of a strange cabin that smelled like wood smoke and wet wool and clay. She blinked in the firelight. She looked at the mortared walls, at the faces of strangers, at the dog sleeping beside the stove. "Papa," she said. Grinde gathered her against him and held her so tightly that Solvi could see his knuckles go white through the dirt and soot on his hands. He pressed his face into her hair and his shoulders shook once. A single hard convulsion like a tree struck by wind, and then he was still. He did not cry. He did not make a sound. But the shaking said everything his voice could not. Ingrid looked over her father's shoulder at Solvi with the frank curiosity of a child who has not yet learned to judge strangers by what other people say about them. "Are you the lady who built the warm house?" she asked. "Yes. Berger told me about it. He said the walls are made of firewood and mud. He said you built it all by yourself. He said you are the smartest person he knows." Something cracked behind Solvi's ribs. Not pain. Something softer. Something more dangerous than pain, because it could not be treated with herbs or bandaged with cloth. She turned back to the stove before anyone could see her face change. "The broth needs stirring," she said. "To no one. To everyone." Because Berger was not in the cabin. Berger was 2 miles north with his mother and his brother in a cabin with proper walls and notched corners and chinking that cracked every winter and let the cold pour through. Solvi did not know if Berta's cabin had held. She did not know if the boy who called this the warm house, the boy who had saved her from leaving with a single question about reading lessons, the boy who carried pickled beets 2 miles without dropping them, was alive or frozen in his bed, or lost somewhere in the white space between here and there. She could not go check. She could not send anyone. The storm held them all in place, and the not knowing was a kind of cold that 16-inch walls could not keep out. She stirred the broth. She fed the fire. She did not think about Birger Haugen because she could not afford to break. Not yet. Not until the storm passed and the living were safe and there was time for breaking. The second day was quieter. The wind still howled, but the violence had peaked. The gusts no longer shook the walls or drove snow through cracks that did not exist. The temperature outside had risen slightly, 30 below instead of 42 below, and inside the cabin held a steady 50 degrees. People began to talk. It started slowly, the way thawing starts. One voice and then another and then a conversation that spread through the cabin like warmth spreading through a wall. Halvorsen spoke first. He told his wife about the cabin walls in a voice loud enough for the room to hear. The thickness. The 16-inch depth. The mortar that went all the way through with no gaps for wind to find. The sawdust cavity that trapped heat the way feathers trap warmth in a quilt. My house has proper walls, he said. Log construction, notched corners, good chinking. I burned 2 cords of firewood in 3 days, and the water bucket still froze solid overnight. My wife kept the children in bed under every blanket we owned, and they still shivered. His voice was flat, bewildered, carrying the weight of a man who has discovered that everything he believed about building and survival and the right way to do things was wrong. This cabin is warmer than my house, built by a 14-year-old girl. From garbage. The widow Angstrom was listening from her place near the door. She had barely spoken since she arrived, conserving energy the way old women learn to conserve everything. But now she leaned forward. How much firewood has she burned? She asked. Since the storm began? A 1/4 cord, Halvorsen said. Perhaps a bit more. The silence that followed filled the cabin the way smoke fills a room. It pressed into every corner. It settled on every face, a 1/4 cord. In the worst blizzard anyone in that cabin had ever experienced. While their own homes, their proper homes built by experienced men with proper tools and proper techniques, had consumed 2 cords, 3 cords, 4 cords, and still failed. Still let the cold in. Still froze the water and the milk. And the hope. Mrs. Voss broke the silence. She was sitting against the west wall with her 3-year-old son in her lap. The boy had not spoken since they arrived. Not a word. Not a cry. Not a whimper. He sat rigid in his mother's arms with his eyes open and his mouth sealed shut and his small body locked in the posture of a creature that has decided the safest response to a terrifying world is to stop being present in it. Mrs. Voss looked at Solvi across the crowded floor. Her face was ruined by the wind. The skin on her cheekbones had cracked open in the cold and dried in the warmth, and now it split freshly every time she moved her mouth. Dried blood lined the cracks like mortar in a wall. I said terrible things about you, she said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but in a cabin 12 feet by 14, packed with 18 people, there was nowhere for a whisper to hide. I told people you were living in sin. I told them you were building a monument to foolishness. I told them you would freeze. and it would be God's judgment on your pride. She pressed her face against her son's hair. The boy did not react. I was jealous, she said, because you had courage and I did not. Because you built something real with your own hands, and I have never built anything except lies about other people. I have no excuse. I am sorry. Solvi did not answer immediately. She was watching the boy. The rigid posture, the sealed mouth, the eyes that were open but seeing nothing in this room, looking instead at something interior, something far away, someplace inside himself where the storm could not reach and nothing could hurt and nothing was required of him. She had lived in that place herself. After her mother died, after the Hendricksons took her in, and she slept on a straw tick in the kitchen corner and ate what was left, and told herself it was temporary. She had gone quiet the same way, gone small, disappeared inside herself until there was barely enough of her left to be seen. She knew what brought you back. Not words, not commands, not adults telling you to be brave or to speak up or to stop being silly. What brought you back was warmth. Simple physical warmth that asked nothing of you and expected nothing and simply existed, steady and patient, until you were ready to feel it. She crossed the cabin and knelt beside Mrs. Voss. May I, she said, and held her hands toward the boy without touching him. Mrs. Voss hesitated. Her arms tightened. Then she loosened them. Solvi did not reach for the child. She reached behind her and found Cora. The dog had been lying beside the fire all day, calm as a stone in a creek, his brown eyes tracking Solvi's movements with the steady devotion of a creature that has chosen its person and intends never to unchoose. Come here, she said softly. Cora rose and padded across the cabin floor. He picked his way over legs and around sleeping forms with the careful precision of a dog that understands crowded spaces. He stopped beside Mrs. Voss and regarded the boy with grave attention. His ears moved forward. His tail was still. His fingers sank into the warmth of the dog's coat, and something in his face shifted. Not a smile. Something before a smile. The thawing that happens before the thaw. His left hand uncurled. Both hands in the fur now. Stroking, slowly. The way you touch something precious that you are afraid might disappear if you hold it too tightly. The rigid line of his shoulders dropped by a degree, then another. His breathing changed, deeper, slower. Cora kept his chin on the boy's knee and his eyes half closed, and he breathed his steady breath, and he let the child's hands find their way back to the world through the simple geography of warm fur and a beating heart. Doggy warm, the boy said. 2 words. The first sound he had made since the storm took his world apart. His voice was small and rough, and it cracked on the second word like ice cracking in spring, and it was the most beautiful sound anyone in that cabin had ever heard. Mrs. Voss pressed her hand over her mouth. Tears ran down her cracked cheeks and followed the lines of dried blood, and she did not wipe them away because she could not. Her hands were shaking too hard to be trusted near her own face. The widow Angstrom wept quietly in her corner. Halverson's wife buried her face in her husband's shoulder. Halverson himself turned toward the wall and was still for a long time. The German mother with the twins held them tighter against her body. Reverend Stenberg closed his eyes and his lips moved without sound. "Can I keep petting the dog?" the boy asked. "You can pet him as long as you want," Solvi said. He was lonely too, once. Someone left him in a dump, and he had nobody. Now he has us. The boy nodded. He kept stroking. Cora's tail moved once against the floor. Not a wag. An acknowledgement. "I am here. You are here. We are warm. That is enough." Reverend Stenberg prayed that night. Not the way he prayed on Sundays, with authority and volume and the certainty of a man who believed God arranged the universe according to his particular understanding of Scripture. He prayed on his knees in the corner of a cabin built from waste wood by a girl he had called a monument to vanity. His hands were folded, but they trembled, and his voice was barely louder than the fire. "Lord," he said, "forgive us for our blindness. Forgive me for mine. I stood in your house and I spoke with certainty about things I did not understand. I judged this child and I was wrong. I judged her walls and I was wrong. I said only you know the weather, and I used your name to excuse my own willful ignorance. I have nothing left to offer you except the truth, and the truth is that I was a fool." No one responded. The prayer was not for them. It was the first honest thing he had said from his knees in a very long time, and the silence that followed it was not empty. It was full, the way a room is full of warmth even after the fire burns low. The cabin door opened near midnight. The sound of the latch lifting cut through the quiet like a blade. Cold air poured in. Solvi was on her feet before she was fully awake, Cora beside her, both of them facing the doorway. A shape fell through the opening. A man. He collapsed on the packed earth floor, and the door swung shut behind him on the wind. Snow covered him from head to boots. His coat was rigid with ice. His face was white with frost, and his eyebrows were frozen solid, and his lips were the color of old ashes. He lifted his head. His jaw was locked so tight the muscles stood out like cords. His eyes were wild with cold and exhaustion, and something else, something that had driven him out of a warm cabin and into the killing dark, when every rational thought in his body was screaming at him to stay. Stellan Lindahl. He had walked 2 miles through the storm, through 40 below wind and 0 visibility and snow that drove horizontal like sand from a cannon. He had left his own cabin, which was warm, which was safe, which would have kept him alive without question. And he had walked into the worst blizzard in a generation because he could not sit beside his own fire and not know if she was alive. Solvi pulled him to the stove. She stripped the frozen coat from his shoulders and wrapped him in the blanket she had been using herself, the only blanket she had not given away. His hands were claws, locked in the shape of fists that had been fighting the wind for 2 hours. She took them between her own hands. She warmed them the way she had warmed every pair of frozen hands that night, slowly, gently. Her fingers pressed against his fingers, the warmth passing between them in the oldest language there is. His jaw unlocked after 20 minutes, his face thawed by degrees, the rigid muscles softening like ice in the first warm days of spring, slowly and then all at once. His first word was her name. Solvi. I am here. I was a coward. His voice was raw, scraped down to gravel. Grinde told me to stay away, and I stayed away. I chose my supply account over you. I chose flour and nails over a person. He closed his eyes. When the storm came, I sat in my cabin and I was warm and I was safe. And all I could think about was you and these walls alone. I could not stand it. I could not sit there and not know. She did not say it was all right. It was not all right. But she did not say it was unforgivable either. Because he was here. He had walked 2 miles through the killing dark. And there were things that words could not say, and only frozen hands and 2 miles of storm and the choice to walk towards someone instead of away could say them. You are here now, she said. His fingers tightened around hers. Not much, just enough. Berger was right, he said. His eyes were closing. The warmth was pulling him down. Berger was right about everything. She held his hands until he slept. Then she laid them gently across his chest and tucked the blanket close and stood and went back to the fire. She fed it one more piece of wood. She checked the thermometer, 51 degrees. She pressed her palm against the wall. Warm, steady, faithful. The wall did not care who slept against it or what they had said or what they believed. It only held the heat and gave it back. That was all it had ever done. That was all she had asked it to do. 19 people now, in a trash cabin, in the worst blizzard in 50 years. The storm died on the morning of the 3rd day. The roar that had been constant for 36 hours faded to a moan, then a whisper, then a silence so complete that people woke and looked around as though the quiet itself were a new kind of danger. Solvi opened the door. The world was white and still. Snow lay in drifts 15 feet high against the north wall. The woodpile was buried. The slash field had vanished beneath a white plain that stretched to every horizon. The sky was blue and clean and empty, the kind of sky that comes after violence, offering nothing, apologizing for nothing. 15 below zero. Warm compared to the night before. She stood in the doorway and breathed air that cut her lungs like broken glass. Behind her, 19 people were alive. 19 people who had come to her door in the dark, some crawling, some carrying children who had stopped moving, some unable to form the word please, but forming it with their eyes. She had opened the door for every one of them. Halverson appeared at her shoulder, coat on, boots laced. The face of a man walking toward what he already knows he will find. I need to check the homesteads, he said. There will be people who did not make it. I know, Solvi said. He stepped into the snow and sank to his thighs and did not look back. The news returned in pieces over the next 2 days, each piece heavier than the last. 235 dead across the upper Midwest, Minnesota, Dakota Territory, Nebraska, Wisconsin. 213 of them children. Caught at school when the storm hit. Sent home by teachers who looked at the warm morning and the blue sky and saw no reason to keep them. Children who walked into the white and never walked out. Some of them found still holding hands. The Lindgren family 4 miles south. Father frozen 30 feet from his barn. Mother and 3 children found huddled together in a cabin where the fire had gone cold. The youngest was 4 years old. She was in her mother's arms. The Gustafson boy. 11. Lost walking home from school. Found standing upright in a field, frozen solid, his school books still under his arm. He had been walking the right direction. He was a quarter mile from home. The Pearson twins, 8 years old, found in a snowdrift, holding hands. A quarter mile from their front door. And Dag Kvernmo, Halverson told her on the second day. He stood outside her door in the snow with the same heavy stance Dag himself had used when he first appeared at the edge of her camp 5 months before. Kvernmo tried to reach his barn when the storm hit, Halverson said. They found him 20 feet from his door, frozen solid. He was 52 years old. 52 years old. 9 Wisconsin winters. A wife and infant son buried in the cold of 81. 4 neighbors helped into the ground. The man who had looked at Solvi with eyes that had seen too much death and told her plainly, without cruelty, that she would die in a pile of rubbish and no one would find her body until spring. She had not died. He had. The rubbish held 52 degrees, and Dag Kvernmo was 20 feet from his own door, under the snow, waiting for spring to find him. Solvi looked at the axe leaning against the cabin wall, her father's axe. The one Dag had carried 2 miles through the forest and left on a stump without apology or explanation, the handle worn smooth by her father's hands, the head kept sharp by a man who did not believe in her walls, but believed in returning what belonged to the dead. He gave her back her father's axe. She wished she could have given him back his warmth. She did not cry, not yet. There were 19 people who needed water and food and a path shoveled through the drifts. The living needed her hands. The dead would wait. The dead had all winter and all the patience that comes with it. But that night, when the last thin soup had been divided and the fire was low and the cabin was heavy with the exhausted silence of people who have survived something they do not yet know how to carry, Solvi sat beside the stove with Cora's head on her knee. She pressed her hand against the wall. It was warm. It was always warm. The trash cabin held its heat the way it held everything, quietly, without complaint, without needing anyone to believe in it. The pile of rubbish held 52 degrees, and the man who named it rubbish lay under the snow, 20 feet from his own door. In the winter, he did not survive. You will die in that pile of rubbish, and no one will find your body until spring. Solvi closed her eyes. She kept her hand on the wall. The warmth moved through her palm and into her bones, and she held it there. The fire crackled. Cora breathed. 19 people slept around her in the cabin she had built from garbage with her own cracked and bleeding hands when she was 14 years old, and had nothing in the world except $9. And a hand axe, and a grandmother's voice in her memory telling her how to stack wood and clay into something that would stand. She was still 14, and she had saved them all. The reckoning began on the 4th day. Halverson returned from his rounds with a list of the dead written on the back of a feed receipt. He read the names standing in Solvi's doorway, his voice flat and even, the voice of a man who has learned that grief expressed too quickly becomes something you cannot control. When he finished, he folded the paper and put it in his coat pocket and looked at Solvi. "It is warm in here," he said. The same words he had spoken the night he arrived. But they meant something different now. Before they had been an observation. Now they were an indictment. Of every proper cabin that had failed, of every man who had told a 14-year-old girl that her walls were garbage, of every decision made by every person who had heard the warning and chosen not to listen. Warmer than my house, Halverson continued. And my house has proper walls. How much wood did you burn during the storm? A quarter cord, perhaps a bit more. He stared at her. I burned 2 cords. My wife kept the children in bed under every blanket we owned, and the water bucket still froze solid overnight. 2 cord. And you burned a quarter. The walls hold the heat, Solvi said. The thick walls and the sawdust in the center. The cold cannot get through fast enough. Halverson said nothing for a long moment. He was not a man who changed his mind quickly. He was a man who changed his mind completely. I would like to learn, he said, how to build these walls. When the snow melts, if you would teach me, I will teach anyone who asks. He nodded once and walked back into the snow. His wife came the next day to see the walls for herself. She pressed her palm against the mortar and held it there for a long time. When she left, she was crying, and Solvi understood that the tears were not about walls or mortar or sawdust. They were about the water bucket that had frozen solid while her children shivered under every blanket she owned. They were about the knowing that it did not have to be that way. The others came one by one over the following week. Each reckoning was different. Each carried its own weight. The widow Angstrom came first after Halverson. She was 53 years old, and she had no sons to help her build and no husband to tell her what was possible and what was not. She stood in the cabin and looked at the walls and asked one question. Can a woman build these alone? I did, Solvi said. The widow nodded. She did not smile, but something in her face opened. A door that had been closed for a long time. Reverend Stenberg came on the 5th day. He stood in the clearing and did not enter the cabin. He removed his hat and held it in both hands. And he spoke to Solvi in a voice stripped of everything except what was underneath. I preached against you from the pulpit, he said. I called you a monument to vanity. I said your pride would be your destruction. I told my congregation to pray for your repentance. He paused. I was wrong about everything. I used God's name to justify my own smallness. I do not expect your forgiveness. I'm not sure I deserve it, but I wanted you to know that I know. Solvi looked at him for a long time. The morning sun was behind him. He looked smaller than he did on Sundays. The door was open during the storm, she said. It is still open now. Stenberg put his hat back on. Thank you, he said, and walked away. He preached a different sermon the following Sunday. Berger told her about it. The Reverend had spoken about humility, about the sin of certainty, about a child who built something that grown men said was impossible. He did not mention Solvi by name. He did not need to. Mrs. Voss did not come to the cabin at all. She did not apologize again beyond what she had said during the storm. But the rumors stopped, completely, overnight, as though a faucet had been turned off. No more whispers about improper living. No more gossip at the dry goods counter. The silence was its own kind of reckoning. Mrs. Voss would never be brave. But she had stopped being cruel, and in a small town that was enough. Sheriff Nyquist rode into the clearing on the 7th day. He dismounted and stood beside his horse and looked at the cabin walls and did not speak for a long time. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a document. The county board met yesterday, he said. Emergency session. In light of the storm and the performance of your structure, they have declined Mr. Grinda's petition to purchase this parcel. The land remains in trust under Mrs. Haugen's name as previously filed." He held out the document. "I have also been asked to inform you that the board has no intention of pursuing trespass charges." He cleared his throat. "Furthermore, I have torn up the eviction notice I served you in November. I should have torn it up then." He mounted his horse and rode away without waiting for a response. And then there was Grinda. He came on the 9th day, alone, on foot. He walked into the clearing the way a man walks into a courtroom when he knows the verdict has already been decided. Slowly, with the measured steps of someone who has practiced this walk in his mind many times and still does not know how it ends. Solvi was splitting kindling by the woodpile. Cora raised his head and growled, low and steady. Solvi put her hand on the dog's neck, and the growling stopped, but Cora's eyes never left Grinda's face. Grinda stopped 10 feet from the cabin door. He looked at the walls, at the mortar lines, at the 16-inch depth that had held 52 degrees when proper cabins failed across 1,000 miles of frozen prairie. He did not look at Solvi for a long time. When he finally did, his face was not the face she had seen at the general store counter, not the smooth confidence, not the small-eyed cruelty, not the smile without warmth. His face was the face of a man who has been stripped of every advantage he ever held and knows it. "I will not contest the land," he said. He held out a folded paper. A letter to the county board withdrawing his claim, signed and dated. Solvi took the paper. She unfolded it. She read it. Then she looked at Grinda. "And my father?" The clearing was silent. Even the wind had stopped. Cora sat motionless at Solvi's side, his brown eyes fixed on the man who stood alone in the snow. Grinda opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For a moment, Solvi thought he might actually say the words, might actually confess that he had betrayed a partner and a friend, that he had told the timber company about her father's prospecting, that his greed had cost her father his livelihood and then his life, that he had spent the months since trying to steal from the daughter what he had taken from the father. "I cannot undo what happened," Grindy said. "That is not what I asked." He looked at her. She looked at him. The letters sat on the shelf inside the cabin. Her father's handwriting. His careful slanted script. "If anything happens to me, the land is Solvi's. Grinday owes me. He owes me everything." Grinday dropped his eyes. He did not say, "I am sorry." He did not say, "Your father was my friend." He did not say, "I was greedy and small, and I destroyed a man for 20 acres of clay." He said nothing at all. But his silence was louder than any confession. It filled the clearing the way the storm had filled the sky, completely and without mercy. "Then go," Solvi said. Grinday turned. He walked back across the clearing. He did not look back. He walked past the slash piles and the stumps and the creek where the clay deposits lay thick and deep and valuable. He walked into the tree line, and he disappeared, and Solvi stood in the clearing and watched the space where he had been until there was nothing left to watch. Niels Grinda left Merrill before the month was out. He sold the general store to a family from Oshkosh and took a train south, and no one in the county heard from him again. The new owners extended credit to every homesteader within 30 miles without conditions. The store became what it should have been all along, a place where people could buy what they needed without fear. Solvi did not speak of Grindy again. She did not show the letters to the sheriff or the county board or anyone who might have used them as weapons. The letters stayed on the shelf beside the jar of pickled beets and the coil of rope. They were not evidence. They were not ammunition. They were her father's words, and they belonged to her, and she did not owe the world her father's pain. The spring came slowly that year. The snow held into April. But when the ground finally thawed and the creek ran clear again, people began to come. Berta Haugen came first. She rode into the clearing on her draft horse with both sons beside her, Carl, who was 12, and Birger, who was 10 now, and who leaped from the horse before it stopped and ran to Cora and threw his arms around the dog's neck and said, "I knew you were alive. I told Mama. I told her every day." Berta dismounted and walked to where Solvi stood. The two women looked at each other. Berta's face was the same face it had always been, hard and weathered and missing nothing. "Teach me," she said. It was not a request. They walked the perimeter together. Solvi explained as they went. The foundation of dry stacked stone. The 16-inch log ends laid transversely, end grain out. The 2 beads of mortar along the inner and outer faces. The cavity between, filled with loose sawdust mixed with lime. The thickness, the density, the mass. The mortar did not crack, Berta said. She touched a joint that had survived the 42 below night without a single fissure. "You said you mixed lime with the clay. Lime and sand and sawdust. The sawdust keeps the mortar from shrinking too fast when it dries. And the wind. The mortar goes all the way through. There are no gaps." Carl was running his hands along the wall with an expression of intense concentration. He was 12, old enough to understand what he was seeing, old enough to help build. "How much firewood did you use?" Berta asked. "From November to the end of the storm, 2.5 cords. Perhaps a bit more. 2.5. Berta's voice was flat with something beyond surprise. "I burned 6. My boys cut wood every day from October to March, and we barely kept ahead." She shook her head slowly. "I told you the mortar would crack and fall out by December. I told you the wind would blow straight through. I said you were building a wood pile and not a house. Yes, I was wrong." The words hung in the cold spring air. Solvi had not expected them, not because Berta was incapable of admitting error, but because the words were so simple and so complete. No qualification, no explanation, no however, or but, or in my defense. Just 3 words that contained everything. "In the spring," Berta continued, "I will add a room to my cabin using your method. Carl will help me stack the logs and mix the mortar. We will cut the pieces from the slash wood the company left behind. I will show you how. I know you will." Berta looked at her sons, then back at Solvi. "You will show anyone who asks. You will not charge for the teaching." It was not a question. It did not need to be. "I did not invent anything," Solvi said. "My grandmother described these walls from Norway. The peasants built this way because they had no long timber. I only remembered. You remembered something that kept you alive when 235 people died. That is worth more than invention." She gathered her sons and walked to her horse. At the tree line, Birger turned and waved. Cora barked once. Solvi waved back. The spread began that spring and did not stop. Halverson built a cordwood shed in March using the technique Solvi demonstrated. His wife reported that it held heat better than their main cabin. By April, they had begun planning a cordwood addition to the house itself. The widow Angstrom came in May. She was 53 years old and she had no one to help her. Solvi spent 4 days at her homestead showing her how to cut and stack the pieces, how to mix the mortar, how to fill the insulating cavity. The widow's walls rose slowly, but they rose. A family named Berglund came from 20 miles away, having heard about the girl who survived the blizzard in a cabin made of waste wood. They stayed for a week learning. Then they went home and built their own. Solvi taught each one who came. She never asked for payment. When people offered money, she refused. The loggers left the wood, she said. The creek gave the clay. I only stacked it. Stellan Lindahl did not leave. He had walked 2 miles through the worst blizzard in 50 years because he could not bear not knowing, and that kind of walking does not lead to a place you leave afterward. He came to the clearing every day through the spring. He helped Solvi repair the storm damage. He split wood. He hauled stone. He did not speak much because he was Swedish, and the Swedes believed that work expressed better than words. But when he did speak, it was to Solvi. And when he spoke, his voice was different, softer. The voice of a man who has stopped at pretending he does not feel what he feels. Berger noticed everything. He is still coming back, Berger said during a Tuesday lesson. His voice was a matter of fact. I am not surprised. He likes you very much. Read the next paragraph, Solvi said. And her face was warm. By 1890, 14 families in the Merrill area had built cordwood structures using the technique Solvi taught. Some built entire homes. Others added rooms to existing cabins, cordwood additions that outperformed the original construction by every measure. The method spread through Norwegian and German immigrant networks, passed from neighbor to neighbor, modified and adapted to local materials and local needs. Solvi never claimed credit. When people asked where she had learned the technique, she spoke of her grandmother in Norway, of the peasant houses in the mountains, of the old ways that worked when new ways failed. She did not mention that she had been 14 years old, alone, with nothing but $9 and a hand axe and a field full of garbage. The walls spoke for themselves. They did not need her to explain. She married Stellan Lindahl in the spring of 1894. She was 21 years old. The ceremony was held in the cabin. Berta Haugen stood as witness. Birger, who was 16 now and taller than his mother and reading everything he could find, stood beside Cora at the doorway and grinned so wide his face could barely hold it. Solvi asked him before the ceremony if he approved. I told you he liked you, Birger said. I told you years ago. Nobody listens to me. They expanded the cabin together that summer. Stellan and Solvi working side by side, cutting and stacking and mortaring the way she had taught him and he had taught himself. 2 new rooms using the same technique. The walls of the addition matched the walls of the original. 16 inches thick. Mortared log ends. Sawdust insulation in the center. She bore 3 children. All of them survived to adulthood. In an era when 1 in 4 frontier children died before the age of 5, this was not luck. It was warmth. It was walls that never dropped below 40 degrees. It was a mother who understood that survival began with shelter, and shelter began with knowledge passed from hand to hand across generations. Birger Haugen became a school teacher. He built a schoolhouse with cordwood walls 3 miles from the clearing where he had learned to read on a stump. He taught 40 children in the first year. He signed his letters to his mother the same way he had since he was 10. Your reading son. Corey died in the autumn of 1899. He was old. His muzzle had gone white years before. His hips ached in the cold, and he walked slowly, and he slept more than he woke. On his last day, he lay beside the fire in the cabin where he had spent 12 years, and he put his chin on his paws, and he sighed the deep sigh that Birger had laughed at years ago, and he closed his eyes. They buried him beside the cabin. Birger, who was 21 now and a teacher and a man, came from 3 miles away and dug the grave himself. He carved the marker from a piece of cedar. Cora. He came when no one else would. He stayed when everyone else left. Solvi stood beside the grave with Stellan's hand on her shoulder and her children around her, and she thought about a thin dog huddled under a collapsed timber frame in a dump near the creek. A dog that had been left to die. A dog that had looked at her with eyes that expected nothing and received everything. She thought about a 3-year-old boy who had stopped speaking in a storm and started again with 2 words. Doggy warm. She thought about Tuesday lessons and pickled beets and a child's laughter in a clearing where there had been no laughter before. She did not cry at the grave. She had cried the night before, alone, with her face in the fur of the old coat she had kept. She had cried enough to fill a year. But at the grave, she stood straight, and she held her family close, and she let the autumn wind move through the clearing where everything had begun. Years passed. Solvi grew older. The cabin grew additions. The slash field grew trees. The community that had once called her cabin a trash pile now called it the warm house, the way Birger had named it when he was 9 years old, and did not know he was naming something that would outlast them all. In the summer of 1935, Solvi sat on the porch that Stellan had built in the spring they were married. She was 62 years old. Her hair was white. Her hands were still strong, but they moved more slowly now. She held a cup of tea and watched the light move across the meadow where stumps had once dotted the hillside. A small girl sat beside her, Solvi's granddaughter, 7 years old. The same age Ingrid Grinda had been on the night she was carried through the storm in her father's arms. The girl was looking at the cabin walls, at the mortared log ends, at the 16-inch depth that was visible where the plaster had crumbled near the foundation. "Grandma," she said, "did you really build this? All by yourself?" "All by myself. Weren't you scared?" Solvi set her tea down. She looked at the walls, at the mortar lines she had pressed into place with her own hands when those hands were young and bleeding and did not know what they were building. "Every single day," she said, "I was terrified every single day. I did not know if the walls would hold. I did not know if the mortar would crack. I did not know if the fire would last, or the food would stretch, or the winter would end. I was 14 years old and I had nothing, and I was so frightened that some nights I could not sleep for the shaking. But you told people the walls would hold." "Yes." "Were you lying?" Solvi smiled. It was the smile of a woman who has lived long enough to understand the difference between lying and choosing. "I was making a promise," she said. "Not to them. To myself. I was saying the words I needed to hear. Because sometimes you do not know if something is true until you have said it enough times to make it true." The girl was quiet for a moment. Then she looked at the walls again. "Will you teach me?" she asked. "What your grandmother taught you?" Solvi reached over and took the girl's hand. It was small and warm and soft. The hand of a child who had never needed to build anything from garbage, who had never been hungry or cold or alone, who had never stacked firewood and clay into something that the world said was impossible. "Yes, my darling," Solvi said. "I will teach you everything." The chain of knowledge ran like a creek through the generations. Solvi's grandmother had learned from her mother in the mountains of Norway. She had taught Solvi's mother. Solvi's mother had taught Solvi. Solvi had taught Berta and Halverson and the widow Angstrom and 14 families and a Swedish logger who walked through a blizzard because he could not bear not knowing. And now she would teach a 7-year-old girl sitting on a porch in Wisconsin in 1935 who would carry the knowledge forward into a world that Solvi could not imagine but trusted would have need of it. Because the world always needs people who know how to build something from nothing. The world always needs people who look at a field of garbage and see possibility. Solvi Asmundsen Lindahl died in 1941. She was 68 years old. She had spent 54 winters on the land where Dag Kvernmo had told her she would freeze to death. The original cordwood walls, built in 8 weeks by a 14-year-old girl with no tools and no help, were still standing when she died. They stood another 11 years before her grandchildren finally took them down to build something modern. The sawdust in the center was still dry. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 70 degrees in 8 hours. The wind hit 60 miles per hour. The sky turned black and green and swallowed the horizon. 235 people died. Children froze walking home from school, some of them found still holding hands. A man named Dag Kvernmo, who had survived 9 Wisconsin winters, who had buried a wife and infant son in the cold of 81, who had told a 14-year-old girl she would die in a pile of rubbish. That man froze to death 20 feet from his own door. The pile of rubbish held 52 degrees. The walls were 16 inches thick. The mortar was clay and sand and sawdust and lime. The logs were crooked and knotty and hollow, pieces that no sawmill would touch, pieces that the logging crews had kicked aside and left to rot. A girl had stacked them like firewood and filled the gaps with mud, and she had survived the worst blizzard in a generation while proper cabins failed all around her. Solvi Asmundsen built her trash cabin with her own 2 hands. She heated it with 2.5 cords of wood when her neighbors burned 8. She lived 54 more years on land that was supposed to be her grave. The wall she built from waste stood longer than the man who said they would kill her. The sawdust in the center was still dry when they finally came down. If you are facing your own storm right now, remember her. She was 14 years old. She had $9 and a hand axe and a field full of garbage that no one wanted. And she built something that outlasted everyone who said it could not be done. You are stronger than you know. The walls will hold. They always do.